This is the very first installment of what we hope will be an every other weekly event, and with the in-between weeks giving you a chance to respond and ask any questions. This is kind of an attempt to take Christianity from the ancient world up until now. We'll start by looking at the New Testament. We live in a time when there's a lot of misunderstanding of exactly what is in this original book that we have. A lot of us have the idea that the New Testament kind of floated down from the heavens and rested, and all of a sudden it became a holy book. And we've wrenched it from its context and wrenched it from how the first people who read it would have read this book. The problem is, when we read it wrongly, we're going to get the wrong lessons from it. And we do this in all sorts of instances. So this book represents about 8, 9 different authors. And as we get into it, we're going to discuss a little more deeply what that means. And it was written over a period of about 50 some years. We tend to think, probably like the New Testament does, that, the first book was Matthew and we move on chronologically through the rest of the New Testament. But that's not exactly how it works. The New Testament, the very first book, was written, we got a pretty good idea on this, around 48 AD. It's not the book you think it would be. It's not Matthew, it's not Mark, it's not any of the Gospels. The first book of the New Testament chronologically is Galatians. The last one is really up for debate. You'll have some people say Revelation, other people say 1 Timothy, some will even say Hebrews or 1 Peter. There's quite a lot of contention on that designation. And for the purpose of this, we'll say it's Revelation. And that's probably not till the mid or late 90s. So we have this period of about 50 years. And we're going to start taking us through this New Testament, book by book, and bit by bit, and hopefully raise some issues then you'll want to ask some questions about. This first week, we're just going to talk about a broad sweep about the background of this New Testament. And some of you might be thinking, well, what does this guy know? Well, maybe not that much. Look, I have an undergrad degree from Olivet Nazarene University. I have a master's degree in New Testament from Wheaton College. And I completed all my PhD coursework from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That includes my Greek, my French, and my German competency. I got to admit, I haven't finished my dissertation. I'm just got a little tired, ran out of money, ran out of a lot of things, but I stay current. Yes, I pastor a church. In suburban Chicago, I also teach New Testament part-time adjunct at Olivet Nazarene University as well. I do my best to represent exactly what this book means and what this book represents. So first we have the New Testament. Let's talk about the world that the New Testament came from. The New Testament was written again in the first century. It was a world that was, yes, you had this intensely zealous group of Jews that lived in Palestine. They weren't that powerful. Over their whole area, Rome was in charge, and they were part of the Roman Empire, really not by choice. See, the Jews had been in Babylon starting at 586 BC, and 50 years later, under a different ruler, a different king, the Persians took over from the Babylonians. Some of the Jews began to return to Palestine, began to rebuild the temple, began to try to set up their nation, their way of life again. It was tough. They were small, they struggled. And after a while, a new Greeks took over. They didn't interfere much. But then you had the Seleucids. The Seleucids were a little regional power that from modern-day Syria, and they took over the area of Palestine. And after a while, one of the successive rulers, Antiochus IV, had the idea that these Jewish people need to worship like everyone else. And so he took over the temple and erected a statue of Zeus, where the Holy of Holies used to be, in the middle of the Jewish temple. And the Jews, of course, rightly, were very upset about that and launched a war of independence. It took 3 years. Some of us might be familiar with some of this. There's one of our modern holidays comes right out of this war, and it's called Hanukkah. In the middle of that, they thought the oil in the temple was running out, and miraculously oil appeared for 8 days, and we have that that holiday of the Jewish people that still commemorates that time. So the Jews are independent now, but they're always small, and they're at the mercy of everybody around them. You still had the waning power, but still had some strength of Egypt to the south. You still had the remnants of the Seleucid kingdom to the north, and this growing Roman Empire, but there was really no one that was in control of their area, so they were at the mercy of everyone around them. So in 63, not because of any war, Rome just kind of took over. They were in charge of the area. They weren't able to resist. There was no big battle. In 63 BC, Palestine, the Jews become part of the Roman Empire. Well, the Jews didn't like being ruled by anyone who wasn't Jewish, so Rome kind of installed a puppet regime with a ruler that was half Jewish, thinking that would placate the people, and Rome put King Herod in charge. Let's talk about King Herod just for a little bit. King Herod was, yes, he was half Jewish, but he was kind of embarrassed of his Jewish heritage. He liked to see himself as a modern Roman citizen. And so because he had loyalty to Rome, Rome installed him, and King Herod became at least a ruler in name only of the Palestinian area. He liked to view himself as a master builder, and once he was in control, he started massive building projects. The most notable of which would have been in Jerusalem. And he rebuilt not only the temple, but the whole Temple Mount. It was a beautiful structure. It was 1/4 mile long. It was a couple football fields wide. He leveled a mountain, filled it in with concrete. The supporting retaining walls were in some places 20 stories high, made with massive blocks that were hundreds of metric tons. And he restored the temple, even made it more glorious than it had ever been before. Now the Jews had their temple, but the Jews also had heavy taxation. Rome taxed them, and Herod taxed them as well. And so they were getting taxed both coming and going, and it was a very heavy taxation. Herod didn't even stop with the temple. If you go to a little town called Jericho, you might have heard of it. Not the Old Testament Jericho, but one almost built next to it on a different site, the New Testament Jericho. Herod built his his winter palace. In this palace, he had a sunken garden with covered porches so you could walk in the shade and watch the plants grow. He had a little shrine where he would welcome dignitaries. And then in the massive residence of this winter temple, he had a hot pool, a cold pool, and a lukewarm pool. Imagine 3 indoor pools in the ancient world just for King Herod to enjoy. Imagine you're one of the 1,200 people that live in Jericho. You try to eke out a living, maybe selling spices or dates or figs, all which grew there, irrigated water from the the Jordan River. Now, you look up every day, you have limited funds, you're trying to get by, and King Herod comes by, and he's taxing you so his hot pool can be hot, and his cool pool can be cool. And imagine the anger that begins to build. I mean, we get upset every April 15th when the IRS comes calling, but we have a say in things. They didn't have any say whatsoever. So you have this very upset, restless group of Jewish people. But the Jews weren't all equal. Let's talk about them just for a second. You had 3 main groups of Jews at that time. You had a group called the Sadducees. If you're familiar at all with the book of Acts, you're maybe familiar with them. They were a small group. However, they were the ones that were in control. They were the ones that had responsibility of the temple. They were very conservative, and when I mean conservative, they liked things to remain just the way they are. They didn't believe in any afterlife. They didn't believe in angels or demons or resurrection. This life was all there was. They were in control of the temple. They wanted people to remain faithful. Because if they remained faithful, they thought the people could always maintain their land and maintain their historic connection to the temple. Then you had another group called the Pharisees. This is who everybody knows. And we have a really bad idea about them. We think they're the bad guys. And really, that all flows from one gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the Pharisees are viewed negatively, largely because of Matthew, but in real life, they weren't really that bad of a group. Their desire was actually for all of the people to have a close contact with their Judaism. And they tried to help them be faithful. So when the people would say, the Pharisees would say, hey, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And after the Pharisees said that, the people would say, wait a minute, how do we keep the Sabbath day holy? And they said, well, you don't lift so much. You don't take so many steps. This is what it means to work. And they started to make these regulations that become famous in the New Testament. It started off innocently enough. A couple generations go by, and pretty soon everybody forgets the reason why something was there to begin with. Reminds me of a young bride who says, after being married less than a year, I want to host the whole family for Thanksgiving. So everybody comes to my house, and I'll do all the cooking, and all the groom's family's coming. And as she's cooking, the groom looks up and sees that she's putting a ham in a pan to bake for Thanksgiving. And he goes, wait a minute, dear, what are you doing? She goes, I'm getting ready to bake a ham. And he goes, wait a minute, you can't bake a ham that way. You have to cut the ends off the ham. Everybody knows that. She goes, I've never heard of that. He goes, no, you have to cut the ends off the ham. So she does. She doesn't want to disappoint her groom and their family. Groom's mom comes about a half hour later, and groom says, Mom, would you tell my wife why you have to cut your ends off the ham? And she goes, well, everybody knows you have to cut the ends off the ham. And his new bride said, I've never heard of that. She goes, that's the only way I've ever learned. And about an hour later, finally the grandmother comes. And the mom and the bride and the groom go to the grandmother and say, Grandma, why do you have to cut the ends off the ham? And she goes, well, you don't. But my roasting pan was only so big, I had to. But see, the bride, the mom, everybody didn't know the story. The Pharisees the same way. What started off as maybe necessary became completely disconnected. So the Pharisees were actually quite popular with the people. And let me tell you one other thing that most of us don't know. And this is not a unanimous opinion, but I think I'm right here. Jesus was a Pharisee. Joseph was a Pharisee. See, there was two groups of Pharisees. One was called the Pharisees belonged to the Hillel school, and that was centered around Capernaum. Then there was a smaller group around a little town called Nazareth that belonged to the Shammai school. They were very devout, very strict. They had this little, not really a quirk, but while everybody else would name their Jewish children names like Jesus or James or Johannes or Cephas, other names we read in the New Testament, Bartholomew, this group named their children only after the patriarchs, and they really were looking forward to the Messiah. They might name their son Isaac or Joseph. And if you had a daughter thinking about the Moses narrative, you might name her Miriam or Mary. So I think Joseph was part of this conservative Pharisee school. And I think he had hopes of advancing and becoming prominent in the community, and so he picked another girl from another prominent family and agreed to marry her. And then she showed up pregnant. And I think that devastated not only him, I think it devastated any chance for him to be seen respectfully in the community. Now Joseph was a carpenter, and just 3 miles away there was a town called Sepphoris that Herod was building again. It was going to be the new capital city. If you'd have been a carpenter, you'd have been employed, you'd have had a great job. Just walk an hour, walk downhill to work from Nazareth and back uphill to home. I think he had just enough to give Jesus a little bit of an education with the Pharisees. Jesus always seemed to be comfortable. You read through the Gospels, they knew who he was. In fact, it's used against him in some of the Gospels. Wait a minute. Don't you call us legitimate, Jesus? You're legitimate, with a wink. We know your story. We know your history. We know who you are. I think Jesus was comfortable at 13 when he was left at the temple and he was found with the religious leaders because he had a little bit of a specialized training. Then you had another group called the Essenes. They were separate. They were celibate. They would copy Scripture. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are the result of the Essenes. John the Baptist, we think, was an Essene. Jesus originally followed John the Baptist for a little bit until he started his own public ministry. But you have a little bit of a window. You have a little window into what the world was like. It was a time when Jesus was born. It was a time of economic boom. It was good times. It had been relatively peaceful. There's some good harvests in the area of Galilee. And Joseph lived in this very good economic time. But they were a little restless. And so we have the New Testament that comes as a result of this time. And so let's keep in mind exactly the kind of world that it was in. So anyway, after Jesus' life, it's not till 30 years later, Mark, the first gospel written, around 60 is written. And we wonder, why on earth would they wait that long? Well, there's two main reasons. First main reason is, well, all the people who first saw Jesus, the eyewitnesses, were dying out. This is a time and place the average person only lived to be about 40. And so if you're past that, you were on borrowed time. A lot of the early believers were dying out. And plus Rome was starting to help them. There's a guy on the throne named Nero. You've heard of him. He made a sport out of killing Christians for his own political well-being. And so they're thinking, wait a minute, if we don't write this down, no one will remember. And so people began to write, people began to collect, people began to save these stories. They started to collect them, copy when they would come in contact with a new one, and send the original copy, and they would copy the one that the other people had, and these started to grow. It's not until 300 years later, I mean, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire around 315. And at that time, these different churches in Alexandria and Ephesus and Rome began to be able to meet with each other and compare notes and compare books. It's not till 397 we have our first list of our modern New Testament at the Synod of Carthage. And so it literally takes 300 years. People wrote this down. People collected it. People guarded it. And some people died for it. It became that important. And I think we need to keep that in mind as well when we approach this book. Established over a number of years. People wrote in their own language, in their own way, at their own time. We think that God whispered into their ear and they fell into a trance and copied word for word. I hope not, because if that's the case, God has terrible vocabulary. And in Mark, can't even write. I mean, Mark is barely literate. And then you have something like John, which is very deep and is beautifully written. And so we have these little differences that we need to respect. Sometimes when I'm teaching my class, I have students go through this exercise and ask them to look up how many, on resurrection morning, who goes to the tomb. And when you read the book of Mark, well, there's two people that go to the tomb, Mary and the other Mary. And you get to Matthew, it's Mary and the other Mary. When you get to the Gospel of Mark, it's Mary, the other Mary, and a woman named Salome. And when you get to the Gospel of Luke, we have at least 5. And when you get to the Gospel of John, it's just one, Mary Magdalene. Now, some people try to do this thing with the New Testament where here's this story that's like, it's like the old tale of if you have 4 or 5 people tending an elephant at a zoo. And you ask them to close their eyes and describe the animal, and the person at the leg describes a big, thick tree stump kind of animal. The person at the trunk has this very flexible idea of what an elephant is. The person by the ears feels the breeze of these giant fans flapping. But the whole story is different. We shouldn't do that with the Gospels. If we do, we're going to have a completely different idea. Here's this whole story out here. And yes, Mark gets part of it, and then Matthew gets part of it, and Luke gets part of it. Why don't we let Mark tell Mark's story? Why don't we let Matthew tell Matthew's story, and Luke tell Luke's story, and John tell John's story? And let them tell the story the way they want to tell it. Then each story tells a little bit different way. In John, all the people are coming one-on-one. It's a series of one-on-one encounters. Matthew, for some reason, likes to double up everything. There's 2 blind men, there's 2 demon-possessed men, and yes, there's 2 people resurrection morning. Let's respect their differences. Let's listen to them, because there'll be a few places they tell the story in ways that we cannot make go together. So as we start going through this, we'll start going through book by book. Maybe this will have sparked a question. If it has, just send us a question in the comments section below. Maybe next week we're going to answer that. If you like the video, please click like. And let us know that we're on something. Send us constructive criticism. We want to make this for everybody. We want to make this for people who really want to know more about the New Testament, that do so in an understandable, fun way. And we'll try to be funny and tell jokes. And yes, I'm a Ohio State fan, and we'll have to explain things to you Michigan people, and an Indians fan. But we'll get through that. Anyway, hope you have a wonderful week. And as we get forward, we'll get going with this more. Have a wonderful, wonderful week.